Hi everyone, this is Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and I'm coming to you today to talk about two things that are very closely related: yarn substitution and gauge. So let's start with gauge, because understanding gauge leads to understanding how it can be used for yarn substitution. Gauge is the number of stitches or rows that you get in a 4-inch square. So most balls of yarn and most patterns will give you a needle size and a gauge. So for example, a ball of yarn can recommend size 6 crochet hook or a size 5 pair of knitting needles, and over 4 inches you should get a stitch gauge. So that's the number of stitches you have horizontally, sideways, of 24 stitches, or a row gauge, so the vertical stitch gauge, so number of stitches you get one on top of the other, of 24 again, let's just say. Those are recommendations. On the ball of yarn, it's just kind of a starting point to get a fabric that the manufacturer thinks is pleasing to the yarn. In a pattern, the needle is a recommendation, and if it's a pattern that gauge isn't important on, so like shawls or scarves or blankets, those kinds of things that aren't shaped and they don't have to fit properly, gauge is just a recommendation for a fabric density. For things that are fitted, gauge is important to get. So you want to be within about a stitch of that 4-inch stitch gauge. Row gauge isn't nearly as important, but for sweaters, hats, socks especially, there's not much room for margin of error in socks. Gloves, anything that you want to fit properly really does need to fit the gauge. So if you're doing a blanket, you don't need to worry so much about gauge unless you want to have the same density of fabric as the creator of the pattern. But for fitted objects, yes, you want to get the gauge within a stitch of the stitch gauge. Row gauge is not so important, like I said, because most patterns have you knit flat until your piece reaches this many inches or centimeters, depending on where you are. Rows can be kind of niggled and negotiated. Stitches can't, because we typically knit in the round, around. So if you want that around to fit your waist or your ankle, that needs to be kind of correct. How do you do a gauge swatch? Well, there's lots of videos on YouTube actually demonstrating it, but basically you want to make a little square that's bigger than the recommended stitch count. So it doesn't matter if you're doing knitting or crochet. You usually want to do about a 6-inch square. That'll give you an inch on each side for your 4-inch measurement. How close do you want to be? Usually within about a stitch. So a stitch to a half a stitch off is usually okay for 4 inches. Because depending on the size of your yarn, 1 stitch per inch can actually lead to a big size difference. You don't have to be super right on, because, well, that shit will block out, but also your tension tends to change. So these are the measurement reasons for doing a gauge swatch. There's also fabric reasons for doing a gauge swatch. You want to make sure that the fabric you're making with the yarn you've chosen actually works for your project. So for example, you can have 2 yarns that are technically a 4-weight in acrylic. So take Red Heart Super Saver and Karen Simply Soft. These 2 yarns are very different in how they feel, in how they drape, and even a size, because a weight of yarn is a range. One of the big tricks is that yarn weight is a range. So, we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So lace weight, fingering weight, sport weight, DK, worsted, Aran, chunky or bulky, super chunky or super bulky, and then freakishly large basically happens in number 7. And the way you determine the weight of yarn, if you don't know, most yarns say something on the label, but you do a gauge swatch. So basically, you see how this has inches measured. So what you do is you start wrapping right at the beginning of an inch, and you wrap so that the wraps line up next to each other. You don't pull super tight, and you do about, exactly an inch. And then once you're there at that inch, see that? That is exactly 1 inch. You count how many wraps you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is 9 wraps per inch. And this is, I love this yarn from Hobby Lobby because it was easy for me to grab. That is within the range of, I believe, 8 to 12 wraps per inch that makes up worsted weight yarn. Because it's a range, 2 yarns are not necessarily going to work the same way, even if they're the same material, because like Karen's Simply Soft is thinner than this and it drapes more. And that gets taken into account with your gauge swatch. You're able, with a swatch, to test a pattern, test stitches you're not familiar with, have a little bit of practice. You also need to wash and block your swatch when you're doing this with an unfamiliar yarn, because some yarns do this thing called blooming. And that's basically, your yarn will be this thick as you're working with it, and it works up exactly the way you want. You could wash this and it could poof up. This one in particular doesn't really, but it could. That's the point. And if it poofs up, it changes the size of your stitches. It'll change the fit of the garment. It'll change how the fabric drapes on your body. And you want to be aware of that before you commit a large amount of money and time to a project, because ultimately we're spending so much time, effort, and money on a project, we want it to turn out right. Now, you don't have to do a swatch if you don't want to. There are some people who are hardcore, I'm never going to knit a swatch types. And then here's what happens. Their garment doesn't fit properly, or something happens with the yarn and they're unprepared. So there are definitely times when it's a good idea to do a gauge swatch. So when you need something to fit, when you want a certain type of fabric, and if you need to practice a stitch pattern, it's the perfect time to swatch. If you've got too many stitches in your gauge swatch, that means your stitches are too small. You need a bigger hook or needle. If you have too few stitches in your gauge swatch, that means your stitches are too big. You need a smaller hook or needle. Again, the hook or needle recommendations in a pattern are just that, recommendations. You can do anything you want and adjust as needed. It's easier to adjust your needles than it is to adjust your tension, because our tension changes day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, based on how we're feeling at that time. Any inconsistency over days or weeks can be blocked out, but it's harder to change. It's harder to make yourself knit looser or tighter than you're naturally inclined to do. You're going to forget at some point, and you're going to see that your tension will very obviously change partway through the project. So it's easier just to change your needles or change your hook and be done with it. So that's not the issue if you're substituting yarn. That's just the big part of why you do a gauge swatch. Now, what does this have to do with yarn substitution? Well, sometimes we don't want to use the yarn that's recommended in a pattern. Sometimes patterns are sponsored by a yarn company. For example, you can go to yarnspirations.com and get a bunch of free patterns. They're well tech edited, they're looked over, most of the mistakes are caught, they'll correct any mistakes that people do find. It's very high quality patterns, but they're free. And that's because every single pattern recommends a specific yarn that Yarnspiration sells. And in doing that, they're making more money off of the yarn. A lot of companies do that. Sometimes very fancy, expensive yarns do that too. And you can always tell when they do this because the yarn is recommended in the pattern and they don't mention weight or fiber or anything like that. So you can't easily substitute it because they want you to buy that yarn from that company. I find it a little annoying because sometimes you don't want to use that yarn. Sometimes you can't get it where you live. Sometimes it's too expensive of a price point. Sometimes you're allergic to the fiber content. Sometimes you want to use something that's already in your stash. Like I use this for this one. I didn't have enough, but hey, it was a project that I wound up, makes a nice little collar. This wasn't the recommended yarn, but it worked out pretty nice for my purposes. Sometimes you actually love this yarn and you'll think it'll be great for this project, but there's a difference in it. Sometimes you want to make this pattern, but you want this weight of yarn. There's lots of different reasons to change yarns. One place that's a good idea to go if you are going to substitute yarn is yarnsub.com. This place, it tells you based on fiber content and or weight or other factors in the yarn, not so much color, but the yarn mechanics itself. What's a good substitution for the yarn that you were given? So that's one place to go to kind of get recommendations if you're looking up the specific yarn. So what I always recommend doing is looking up the yarn that is recommended in the pattern and seeing if you can get something kind of close to that in terms of fiber, because silk is very drapey, for example, and it's very pearlescent. A good substitute for it is actually bamboo, but if you want something that's like super 100% wool, it's not going to behave the same. Acrylic typically doesn't behave the same as alpaca. Polyester, getting a chenille yarn, which is very fluffy and squishy, is not going to substitute very well for bamboo, which is very smooth or drapey, or cotton. You don't want a chenille yarn in place of cotton. It doesn't do the same thing at all. And I do have a video on different fiber types and what they're good for. I'll link that in the video description down below. In fact, anything I mention by name, I'm going to do my best to link in the description box. But sometimes you want to change a yarn, not just because of the fiber, but because of the size. Sometimes you have a lovely yarn in fingering weight and you want to make something that's supposed to be in worsted weight. What do? Well, you could hold two strands of the fingering weight together. That makes about a DK to a worsted weight, depending on the specific thickness within that range of fingering weight size. You can hold two of them together, but again, you'll need to gauge swatch to make sure that it drapes the way you want it to and that it actually does fit the correct size. Or you can actually just do it in a different size. So you want to do this pattern in worsted weight, but you have DK. It's a little bit thinner. It'll be a little more drapey. You're cool with that, but you still want it to actually fit your body. How do you deal with this? This is where the gauge swatch comes in, because you swatch your yarn that you have. We'll call this your new gauge because it's the gauge that you need to operate off of. It is going to be different than the recommended gauge in the pattern, but we can handle that. So a pattern gives you all the numbers that you need for making the garment. You know, cast-ons, like for necks, bind-offs for sleeves, whatever it is, or underarms. You have increase rows, you have decrease rows, you have proportions. All these numbers are in your pattern, and they are specific to the size, assuming you got the gauge that they recommend for the pattern. So what you're going to do so you can alter all of these numbers is find the proportion, the ratio, the percentage that you have to change all these numbers. It's actually very easy math. Get a calculator and you won't have a problem. There's a calculator on your phone. Go get that now, get your pattern, and do up your gauge swatch. And I'll walk you through it. So what you do is you make your gauge swatch and you check your stitch gauge. So that's the horizontal one that we have to worry about. You can do this for row gauge. You don't have to, because you're still knitting to measurements. And if you want to be super specific, you can. I just use stitch gauge because it's usually pretty close in terms of the ratio that you're finding. So basically, take the original stitch gauge in your pattern gauge, and then divide that by your swatch gauge, your new gauge. That will give you a number. Now, if your yarn is thinner than the recommended yarn, you're going to have a whole number that may have some decimals after. If you're doing a larger yarn, a thicker yarn, your number is going to be a decimal. Round this number to, I recommend 4 decimal places for maximum accuracy. You're going to round it to a whole stitch later. Just 4 decimal places is a good accurate place to start. This is the number you're going to multiply everything by. So what happens when you multiply decimals that don't have a whole number in front of it is you're going to have fewer stitches. You're going to have a thicker yarn, so you're going to need fewer stitches. You're going to have a thinner yarn, you're going to need more stitches, so the whole multiple with the decimals is going to make more stitches. And you do that to all the numbers in your pattern. You know, if you say have a cast on of 100 stitches and you are using a yarn that's smaller and your multiple is 2.5, for example, 2.5 times 100 is 250. You're going to now cast on 250 stitches to get the same measurement you originally would have. If your decimal was 0.89, 100 times 0.89 is 89. You're going to cast on 89 stitches because your yarn is thicker. Okay, once you have this ratio, you want to apply it to every single number in the pattern except for one. If you have an increase round and you're supposed to knit 3, increase 1, knit 3, increase 1, knit 3, increase 1 all the way around, that itself is a proportion of 3 to 1. You want to keep that. It may not work out perfectly, but that's something you want to keep. Because you're starting with more or fewer stitches, you want to increase in that proportion. So keeping it 3 to 1, knit 3, increase 1, knit 3, increase 1, or whatever your specific pattern requires. Keep that the same. You're going to increase more or fewer stitches based on what you already have there. But if you've got something that's a row repeat, so A lot of sweaters, to do some shaping, will have you knit 10 rounds evenly and then have you decrease for 1 round. And then they'll have you do another 10 flat, and then they'll have you decrease for another round. So this is an 11 round repeat. So at this kind of thing, you'll want to take the number of rounds that you knit flat and multiply your number. It's always multiplying, it's never dividing. That is nice and easy. This is also the one where if you want to be super precise, you find and you do the same math with the row gauge, where you take the pattern row gauge and divide by the row gauge you got in the swatch. That'll be your row ratio, and that will help you figure all this out. You're still multiplying it against the numbers for any row repeats that you need to do. So any number of row repeats that you need. You can either do the number of rows in the repeat itself if it's something very simple, or you can do the total number of repeats. You don't need to do both because one pretty much covers it for the other, but just to be on the safe side, do one or the other, not both. So, with that being said, I think I've covered everything regarding gauge swatches. I have the horrible feeling that I forgot something, and if I have, I'll record an addendum after this. If not, have a great day. I hope this helped you. Leave questions in the comments, and I'll hopefully get to them very quickly. Have a great week. Bye.